Hey everyone, it's David Sirota. So when President Trump campaigned for office, he promised that as president, quote, "I'm not going to let Wall Street get away with murder." That was his promise. We uncovered, however, documents that show that the president's administration recently effectively waived punishment for 5 banks whose affiliates were convicted in a massive global interest rate rigging scheme. Here's the situation. Remember the so-called LIBOR scandal? That scandal was all about banks effectively rigging global interest rates so that they could profit off of them. A number of banks' affiliates were convicted of their role in that. When various banks get convicted of crimes, it triggers a series of laws that include punishments. One of the laws is in the laws that govern how retirement assets are managed and who can manage retirement assets. We're talking about pension funds and the like. The landmark law that governs that basically has provisions in it saying that if a bank or its affiliates have been convicted of securities fraud and all sorts of other financial crimes, it can't manage money for retirees. It's basically a way to both protect retirees from financial institutions that engage in shenanigans and also punish banks that engage in financial crime. It's also a way to create a deterrent. If you want to continue the lucrative business of managing retirees' money, you better stay clean, you better not commit crimes. That's the basic theory. What ended up happening, however, is these banks, 5 mega banks, got convicted in their role involved in LIBOR, and then what ended up happening was the Trump administration issued a series of waivers allowing those banks to continue managing retirement assets. Now, to be clear, the Obama administration had also approved temporary 1-year waivers for many of these banks. And President Obama got a little bit of flack for doing that. People were asking, well, you haven't prosecuted Wall Street in any serious way, and now you're offering waivers to banks to allow them to continue this lucrative business. Trump has now extended those waivers, in many cases, longer waivers, larger waivers, more lucrative waivers, to many of these same banks. And here's one of the important points. One of the banks that received a waiver recently is Deutsche Bank. And Deutsche Bank and Trump have a very deep financial relationship. Trump owes anywhere between $130 million and $300 million reportedly to Deutsche Bank. This has raised all sorts of conflict of interest questions over the last year. How can the president be owing so much money, him and his business empire, so much money to a bank that his administration has so much regulatory oversight over? Does that pose a potential conflict of interest? Well, here's a situation in which the bank that Donald Trump and his business empire have a deep financial relationship with, and he and his business empire owe millions and millions of dollars to, that bank got a lucrative waiver allowing it to continue managing retirement assets and effectively avoiding the punishments that are supposed to hit a bank when they violate the law. Deutsche Bank was one of the 5 banks that was involved and convicted. Its affiliate was convicted for its involvement in the global interest rates rigging scheme. So you have a situation here where, in general, the Trump administration is waiving penalties for banks after the president, as a candidate, promised to get tough with Wall Street. And in specific, one of the waivers is flowing to a firm that Trump and his business empire have a specific financial and business relationship with. The question of whether these waivers should have been granted is a big question. And when we reported this story at International Business Times, one question that came up was, well, if Obama did it, it must mean it's okay, right? And my view was, that doesn't mean it's not newsworthy. Just because the Obama administration waived penalties doesn't mean that when the Trump administration waiving penalties doesn't mean that that's not news as well. But it does show, I think, also the fact that the willingness to go easy on big mega banks, these huge financial conglomerates that have so much political power, that the willingness to go easy on them is oftentimes something that happens with both political parties. But also in this case, the conflict of interest question. I mean, I think it's a huge question. Deutsche Bank is a huge bank with a huge amount of business and potential business with the federal government. The Justice Department has been scrutinizing the bank. There was a situation in which the U.S. attorneys reportedly subpoenaed documents, bank documents from Deutsche Bank in relation to a potential investigation of the Kushners. So Deutsche Bank has a lot of potential interests in business with the federal government, and it is the creditor of the person at the top of the federal government. I think this story about the waivers will continue to stoke questions about conflicts of interest. And can a federal government whose president and the president's business empire owes money to Deutsche Bank, can that federal government impartially apply the law to that same bank? It's a big question, and it's the kind of question that's going to continue.